Hi everyone, welcome to this session about hacking Kubernetes for beginners. I'm Benoit Hensman and I'm working as a DevOps consultant for the company DBI Services in Switzerland. A very simple agenda today. We will talk about hacking Kubernetes, but for the beginners. That means we will not enter into the details of all the commands to hack a Kubernetes cluster, but we'll just show the principle how it is possible to hack a Kubernetes cluster and increase awareness in this area. So let's start with a few definitions first before we dive into the hacking part. So I like this definition of a hack from Bruce Schneier, who is a very famous security expert, where he says a hack is not something magical, it's just something that has been unplanned by the designer and give a possibility for an exploitation. A good example for the hacking mind is to solve this well-known puzzle to connect 9 points with 4-line segments. So if you stay inside of the box, you can try various ways, but there is always 1 point left. So to solve this issue, you need to think outside of the box and find a creative way to make it work, to connect those line segments. Let's define a cybersecurity terminology with a picture. So the mountain is the IT infrastructure you are taking care of. So you have operating system, you have several components with operating system. On top of it, you have the networking. Then you have the web application. And now with Kubernetes, we have a new infrastructure inside this infrastructure that can host, for example, web application. That means that it's something now that can be attacked and that has to be defended. To defend a system, it's called the blue team. So the blue team could be the river in front of the mountain to defend your infrastructure. And the red team is the team that's going to try to attack your component, so Kubernetes here, by throwing some firewall to your system. So also you have the purple in the middle. That means that's a team that is able to do both defend and attack. And it is what we are going to see in this presentation. We'll see 5 examples of how you could hack a Kubernetes cluster. And for each of them, we'll see what is the standard way of interacting with the component and how it could be attacked, and then how we can mitigate that attack. So this is our Kubernetes cluster we are going to play with. We've got one master, 2 workers, and 1 registry in the middle. So you know probably already that the master has some components that make him a master. Each component is usually a pod. So the pod is the blue rectangle. Inside the pod, you have a container, which is the orange rectangle. And inside the container, you have an image that is running. Also, you have other components like the kubelet, which is a service used to create the pod in my cluster, and the kubectl command binary that is used to interact with my cluster. So we will see some of these components in action and see how we can hack them and how we can protect them as well. So let's start with our first example about hacking a kubelet. So that's me. I'm a Kubernetes administrator and I would like to interact with this cluster. So I am connected to the master node and I'm going to use the kubectl binary to jump into a pod. So I run my command and I reach the API server, which is the central component that check the syntax and validate all the command I sent to the cluster. The API server interacts with the etcd, which is the component that is the database of my Kubernetes cluster. And this database is a key value um, format database, contain all the configuration and the state of my cluster. In this case, I just would like to get the name of the node on which the pod is hosted. When I got this, I contact the kubelet component. So the kubelet component is the service on each node of my cluster that interact with the API server, and that is a kind of a gatekeeper for everything regarding the pod. And in this example, is going to reach the pod I'm looking for to jump into it. So that's the way the system is designed. That's how you jump into a pod when you are interacting with a Kubernetes cluster. I will now take the role of the red team. You can see my laptop becomes red. I put my hacker mask on, but you can still see my hair because I'm only an amateur. And I would like to attack this component, the kubelet. So to do so, I create a curl command to communicate directly with the kubelet on the port 10250. That's the port the kubelet is listening on. And I am unauthenticated, but still I can send some commands to that kubelet. And when I do so, I'm able to jump into the pod and reach the content of that pod, of that container in that case. So you can see that's something that's possible, that's not wanted by the designer, and so that's a hack. Let's see how we could mitigate that attack. So I am the attacker, I am the red team, and I have my curl command to interact directly with the kubelet. So I throw my attack to the kubelet component, but now this component has been protected by the blue team, the defender team. And that is Dominic. He is our security officer at DBI Services, and he just has set some parameters into the kubelet configuration to mitigate that attack that is not possible anymore. This attack has been successfully mitigated, and so it's 1 point for the blue team. So let's continue with our second scenario, where I would like to connect to one of the websites that is hosted into my Kubernetes cluster. So to do so, I just use my web browser and enter the URL of my website. This request at some point reach the ingress object of my Kubernetes cluster. So this object is just going to parse my URL and find the service that is going to serve that URL. The service component in the Kubernetes cluster is just a load balancer to reach all the pods that are served by this service. So in this example, I may have several front end, and each front end is one endpoint of my service. And so my request is going to be load balanced to one of my front end. When I reach the front end, I load the page from the website where I have to authenticate by entering a user ID. I enter my user ID, and this information is checked against the backend that contain my database, and then I can connect to my website and start to interact with it. I now take the role of the attacker again, and I use the same web browser and the URL of the website I would like to attack. So this request is going to reach the ingress like before into my Kubernetes cluster. Then I reach the service in the cluster. That's going to reach one of the front end of my website. And when I reach the front end, I get the user ID, and that's the component I would like to attack. So now instead of entering a traditional user ID, I'm going to craft a command, for example, a MySQL command. And by doing so, I will be able to attack the back end and take control of the backend with, for example, a reverse shell. And when I do so, I've entered into the container. Let's see now how that attack could be mitigated. So I have an attack, I use it again the same way as before. I reach the front end, I get the user ID from the front end, and then I try to enter my MySQL command, for example. But now it doesn't work anymore because the blue team has fixed the code and add some additional control on that output. And by doing so, it has successfully mitigated that attack. And so it's a second point for the blue team. We can now see our third scenario. So if the previous attack was successful, that means I had the ability to get a shell into a container, and so I am into the Kubernetes system. But as a hacker, I don't know what is my environment. I don't know if this is a server or this is a container. So I have to do some reconnaissance first, and I just enter a few commands you can see here, and I can see I have the root access in this environment. Also, I see I am into a Kubernetes environment, and that Docker is installed and running. That means I am into a Docker container. That give me some very precious information on how to escape that container. With this information, now I can try to attack the container. So I prepare some bash commands, I put them into a script, I run the script, and now you can see I successfully escape the container and reach the worker node that is hosting my container, and I am root on that worker node as well. So let's see how this attack could be mitigated. So I am into the container. I have my script I have prepared. I know work to escape that container and reach the host node. I run my script, but now you can see with the prompt, I cannot escape. I'm still inside of the container. That's because the blue team has set some parameters on this container to secure it and has then successfully mitigated that attack again. And it is another point for the blue team. Okay, next scenario now is about hacking a registry. So I'm a Kubernetes administrator and I would like to create a new pod into this cluster. And this pod is going to use the image light green that is stored inside my registry. So to do so, I use my kubectl command like before. I reach the API server to validate my command, and the API server is going to store that command into the etcd database. Now there is another component that comes into play. That's the scheduler that is regularly checking with the API server if there is something new to do. In that case, there is something new. He has to create a new pod. And so he's going to run his algorithm and select a worker node for this new pod. When he chooses one, he gives that worker node name to the API server. And so the API server is going to communicate with the kubelet of that worker node. The kubelet, the job of this kubelet is to create that pod, and he create that pod with the request by using the light green image from the registry, and he's going to create the pod, and inside the pod he's going to create the container that is using my light green image. Now, as an attacker, if I have access to the registry, I could replace one of the image with my own, and I could, for example, add into this image a reverse shell that will give me the ability to connect to any container that is using that image. So I kind of poison that image and replace it with my own. And so now I could be any user of the Kubernetes cluster. I will just do my administrative task like before. I would like to create a pod like before by using the light green. That's the image that has been poisoned. And so everything is the same. I don't need to be a hacker anymore. I'm a standard user. I run my command. And when that pod is going to be created and the container inside it is going now to use my poisoned image, and so my container is vulnerable, and I will be able as a hacker to get access to that container. This attack could be mitigated by the blue team because they can scan the image, see if there is something suspicious, and maybe compare the hash key with the known hash key of my original image. And if it's not the same, then they could replace that image and so restore a safe version of my image. And that's a fourth point for the blue team. This is our last scenario where I am a Kubernetes administrator with malicious intent, or I am just a hacker that has gained capabilities um, to create a pod into the Kubernetes cluster. So if I have this capability to create pod into the Kubernetes cluster, it doesn't mean that I have the root access on the host itself, so on the master node in this example. So you can see with my account, I cannot list the content of the root folder. But I am an Kubernetes administrator, so I am able to create a pod with some specific privilege. I can apply that pod and deploy it into my cluster. And now when I jump into that pod, I am now able to list the root folder on the host that hosts that pod. And I've so used Kubernetes for hacking. So how could we mitigate that attack? It's not so easy as it was before because you need to have some Kubernetes administrator that are able to create pods. Um, and so if they have these rights, they are able to jump into the host itself with root access. It's not because they have these possibilities that they have to use it. So the thing that you can do is to restrict how many users have the administrator right and also closely monitor their action in order to detect if there is some suspicious activities. In that case, it's a 50-50 between the blue team and the red team because you can limit the scope of the attack, but there is still a possibilities for an attacker to use it. So let's wrap this up and see what we have learned from this presentation. So this is our Kubernetes cluster. We have used as a playground for the battle between the red team and the blue team. So we have seen we could attack a kubelet, we could attack a container, we could attack the registry, we could attack the host directly or by escaping the container itself. And so there are different ways to attack a cluster. And that's why the job of the defense is very difficult because if any of these attacks succeed, then your cluster is compromised. We have seen only a few components that could be attacked and defended. Of course, there are much more. And if you want to go further, there are some very good books out there. The Hacking Kubernetes is very detailed about some example of attack and defense as well. Container security, go very deep into the technology of the container and how you can secure it. Also, you can have some Kubernetes security and observability that will provide you more information in this area. And the Hacking Expose series that is quite old, but is still interesting because it shows you some example of web application attack. And now, as the web application are hosted into the Kubernetes cluster, we still are exposed to the same kind of attack. And in that way, it's an interesting to know more in this area as well. That's it for today. I hope this was interesting for you. I thank you for your attention and I wish you a very good day.